June 6, 1944. It is 1:45 in the morning. A suffocating darkness hangs over the Norman countryside, broken only by the low, distant thrum of hundreds of heavy aircraft engines vibrating through the clouds. A veteran German lieutenant stands in the courtyard of a requisitioned stone manor house near St. Mary-Église. He is a professional soldier, a product of the finest military academy in Europe. He knows the rules of engagement. He knows that an invasion is coming, and he expects it to arrive with the clinical order of a Prussian textbook, an aerial bombardment, a naval barrage, and then a clean, recognizable front line advancing from the beaches. Suddenly, the sky above him explodes with anti-aircraft fire. Tracers cut through the low clouds in long arcs of green and red, and then the sky begins to rain men. Massive, green silk parachutes materialize out of the mist. Heavy boots crash onto the slate roofs of the village. Figures silhouette against the flashes of flak fire. Monstrous, bulky shapes loaded down with weapons, explosives, and bizarre equipment. The German lieutenant sprints to his command bunker, screaming for his men to stand to. He pulls his Walther pistol, expecting a coordinated assault on his position. Instead, the night dissolves into absolute, incomprehensible chaos. From the shadows of a nearby orchard, he hears a strange, metallic clicking sound. Click-clack. It sounds like a child's toy cricket. A German sentry shouts a challenge into the dark. The response is not a military password. It is a deafening blast from a Thompson submachine gun. For the next 4 hours, the lieutenant receives reports from across his sector, and every single report contradicts the last. A dispatch rider arrives, bleeding, claiming an entire regiment of American paratroopers has landed to the north. 10 minutes later, a frantic radio call from a nearby artillery battery claims the Americans are attacking from the south. A static defense post reports that American soldiers are wandering through the swamps, leaderless, firing at everything that moves. There is no front line. There is no recognizable formation. There is no logic to the attack. When the sun finally rises over Normandy, the German lieutenant is captured along with the remnants of his staff. As he is marched away, he looks at the men who broke his defenses. They are not fighting in neat platoons. They are a ragtag collection of mixed units, men from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, mixed with lost glidermen, clerks and pathfinders, all fighting together under officers they met just 3 hours ago. Weeks later, inside the highly classified archives of the German High Command, intelligence officers would compile a comprehensive, terrifying after-action report detailing the combat behavior of these American paratroopers. It was a report so damning to the core philosophy of the German military elite, and so deeply embarrassing to the aristocratic officer corps, that senior generals did everything in their power to bury it, classify it, and hide it from Adolf Hitler. They were looking for a breakdown of a standard military unit. Instead, they had documented a psychological virus that had completely paralyzed their multi-billion-dollar Atlantic Wall. To understand why the German officer corps was so desperate to hide this intelligence report, you have to understand the rigid, bureaucratic masterpiece that was the German defensive plan for Western Europe. For over 2 years, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the German High Command had been preparing for the Allied invasion. They had constructed the Atlantic Wall, a continuous line of concrete pillboxes, massive artillery batteries, millions of beach obstacles, and deeply layered minefields. The entire system was designed around perfect predictability. The Germans knew the Allies would have to land at high tide. They knew they would have to secure the roads leading away from the beaches. Therefore, the German defense was a masterpiece of static geometry. Every artillery piece was sighted to hit a specific square yard of the beach. Every machine gun nest had a predetermined zone of destruction. To prevent the Allies from using airborne troops to bypass these coastal fortifications, Rommel ordered the low-lying valleys of the Murderet and Douve rivers to be intentionally flooded. Millions of gallons of water created massive, invisible inland lakes covered by thick marsh grass. Any paratrooper dropping into those zones would drown under the weight of his own equipment. On paper, the German trap was flawless. If the Allies dropped their paratroopers into the designated drop zones behind the beaches, they would be isolated, surrounded by flooded terrain, and systematically wiped out by elite German counterattack divisions. But on the night of June 6th, the Allied plan did not survive the first 10 minutes. As the massive fleets of C-47 transport planes carrying 13,000 American paratroopers crossed the coast of France, they hit an unexpected, impenetrable wall of low clouds and ferocious anti-aircraft fire. The flight formations instantly shattered. Pilots, blinded by the mist and panicked by exploding flak, broke formation. They accelerated, veered off course, and began dropping their human cargo at completely random intervals, from completely wrong altitudes, across hundreds of square miles of the Norman countryside. Paratroopers were dropped miles away from their weapons containers. Officers were separated from their companies. Generals landed alone in cow pastures. To any traditional military theorist, the American airborne operation was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. The elite spearhead of the Allied invasion had been completely scattered like autumn leaves in a hurricane. By all the laws of military science, a scattered army is a defeated army. But the German High Command was about to learn that when you shatter an American division, you do not destroy it. You simply create thousands of independent, hyper-aggressive fragments that do not know how to surrender. The flaw in the German military machine was not a lack of courage or a lack of weapons. It was a fatal systemic vulnerability built into their very concept of command. The German military operated on a philosophy known as Befehlstaktik, a rigid, top-down chain of command where local commanders waited for explicit, detailed orders from the high command before executing major movements. While the Germans had a tradition of local initiative called Auftragstaktik, by 1944, the paranoia of Adolf Hitler and the hyper-bureaucracy of the OKW had completely choked it. Every major reserve unit, including the vital panzer divisions, was locked down. They could not be moved without the personal authorization of Hitler himself. When the chaotic American drops began shortly after midnight, this rigid German command loop was instantly fed a massive dose of lethal misinformation. Because the American paratroopers were scattered everywhere, German listening posts across the entire Cotentin Peninsula began reporting enemy contact simultaneously. At 2 a.m., the German 7th Army headquarters received a report that hundreds of paratroopers had landed near Valognes. 5 minutes later, another report claimed a massive drop had occurred near Corentin, 30 miles away. To the German staff officers sitting in their underground bunkers, these reports made absolutely no tactical sense. According to the textbook, an airborne drop should be concentrated on a specific strategic objective. A drop spread across the entire peninsula could only mean one of two things. Either the Allies had dropped a massive army of over 100,000 men, or the reports were false. The rigid German system demanded absolute verification before acting. Local commanders refused to move their troops to counter the landings because they didn't know where the main force actually was. They phoned their superiors, who phoned their superiors, who ultimately found out that Adolf Hitler had taken a sleeping pill at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, and no one dared to wake him to release the panzer divisions. While the German generals sat in their bunkers, staring at maps that made no sense, waiting for orders that never came, the scattered American paratroopers were operating under a completely different set of rules. They didn't have orders. They didn't have their heavy weapons. Most of them didn't even know where they were. But they knew one fundamental truth. They were surrounded by enemies, and the only way out was to fight forward. The environment of Normandy was supposed to be a death trap for the airborne. Rommel's flooded marshes did indeed claim the lives of many men who drowned in the dark. But for those who survived, the landscape became a hunting ground. Normandy is defined by the bocage, a labyrinth of ancient earth walls, topped by thick, tangled hedgerows that have grown for centuries. These hedgerows turn every single field into a natural, enclosed fortress. Visibility is limited to a few dozen yards. The Germans had trained to defend these fields using coordinated, interlocking machine gun fire. They expected to fight regular American infantry units advancing in standard, predictable skirmish lines. Instead, the Germans found themselves fighting a phenomenon that historical analysts would later call LGFs, little groups of paratroopers. An LGP was a completely organic, spontaneous combat unit. It might consist of a captain from the 82nd Airborne, a couple of privates from the 101st, a lost sergeant from an engineering battalion, and a stray gliderman. They didn't know each other's names, but they had a shared objective. They would gather in the darkness of a hedgerow, look at the nearest German position, and decide to attack it. Because they had no heavy artillery, these small groups relied on extreme, terrifying aggression. They used the dense hedgerows to stalk German patrols. They bypassed major strongpoints and ambushed supply lines, communications columns, and staff cars from behind. To the German soldiers defending the hedgerows, the psychological impact was devastating. They were trained to expect an enemy in front of them, but now they were taking fire from the woods to their left, the swamp to their right, and the orchard behind them. Every time a German unit attempted to retreat or reposition according to their manual, they would stumble into another isolated group of Americans hiding in a ditch. The Americans were violating every single rule of military professionalism. They were moving in the dark, they were fighting without logistical support, and they were launching suicidal frontal assaults on heavily fortified positions, with nothing but rifles and hand grenades. The German static divisions, consisting of many older men and conscripts from occupied territories, began to panic. They believed they were being hunted by a phantom army that was thousands of men strong, completely unaware that the regiment suppressing them was actually just 15 lost teenagers from Ohio and Texas with a broken machine gun. The absolute supremacy of this chaotic American initiative culminated in the brutal, bloody struggle for a single, obscure piece of Norman geography, the Lafayette Bridge. The Lafayette Bridge was a small stone structure crossing the flooded Murderette River. It was one of the few pieces of high ground that allowed access from the D-Day landing beaches into the interior of the Cotentin Peninsula. If the Germans held the bridge, they could trap the American forces on the beaches and destroy them. If the Americans took the bridge, they could break out and capture the vital port of Cherbourg. By the morning of June 6th, the German 1057th Grenadier Regiment, backed by captured French tanks, moved toward the bridge to secure it. They were an organized, fully supplied mechanized force. Defending the bridge was a ragtag assembly of roughly several hundred American paratroopers who had gravitated toward the sound of gunfire. They had no heavy anti-tank guns, no armor support, and very little ammunition. They were commanded by a collection of officers from different companies who had simply agreed to work together. The Germans executed a textbook military assault. They launched a heavy mortar bombardment to soften the American positions, and then sent their tanks rumbling across the narrow causeway, followed by columns of disciplined infantry. According to German tactical geometry, the Americans should have pulled back. Their position was completely exposed, they were heavily outnumbered, and they had no conventional means to stop armored vehicles. But the paratroopers did not look at the manual. As the lead German tank crossed the bridge, an American soldier stepped out from behind a stone wall with a primitive shoulder-fired bazooka rocket launcher. He fired at point-blank range, disabling the tank and blocking the causeway. When the German infantry tried to fan out through the flooded marshes, American riflemen, positioned in the surrounding hedgerows, opened a murderous volume of rapid, semi-automatic fire. For 3 agonizing days, the Germans launched attack after attack against the Lafayette Bridge. They used their superior numbers, their heavy artillery, and their armored vehicles. Every time they broke through the initial line, small groups of paratroopers would launch immediate, hyper-violent countercharges into the teeth of the German fire, often using nothing but their bayonets and trench knives. The German officers could not understand the tactical rationale of their enemy. The Americans were suffering horrific casualties. They were completely cut off from rescue. Yet, every time the Germans offered them a chance to surrender, The Americans responded with profanity and intensified their fire. On June 9th, the remnants of the paratroopers, reinforced by regular infantry arriving from the beaches, launched a final, desperate charge across the exposed causeway, directly into the German machine guns. They broke the German line. The 1057th Grenadier Regiment was shattered, its tanks destroyed, its infantry routed. A collection of lost, dropped paratroopers had held the line against an organized mechanized force for over 72 hours. They had broken the German defensive spine in Normandy, and they had done it entirely on their own initiative. In the weeks following the Allied breakout from Normandy, German military intelligence officers compiled a detailed, analytical report on the combat performance of the American airborne divisions. The report was shocking. It did not focus on the technical specifications of American weapons or the quality of their rations. Instead, it was a profound, terrified analysis of the American soldier's mindset. The intelligence officers noted a devastating truth. The standard American paratrooper possessed a completely unpredictable level of personal initiative. The report stated that when an American officer was killed, the non-commissioned officers, or even the lowest-ranking privates, would immediately step forward, assume command, and continue the mission without a moment of hesitation. They did not wait for orders. They did not panic when isolated. They simply adapted to the chaos and continued to attack. To the aristocratic German general staff, this report was an existential threat. For generations, the German military elite had justified their supreme social and political status by claiming that their rigid, professional officer corps possessed a unique monopoly on tactical genius. They believed that a conscript army from a democratic society like the United States would always dissolve into a leaderless mob the moment their communications were cut and their commanders were killed. But the report from Normandy proved the exact opposite. It proved that the democratic, individualistic nature of American society had produced a soldier who was actually better suited for the chaotic, decentralized reality of modern war than the highly disciplined, obedient German soldier. The American draftee didn't need a general to tell him to fight. He was entirely capable of inventing his own war on the spot. Senior German generals tried desperately to hide these findings. They classified the reports, buried them in deep archives, and altered their official after-action summaries to blame the defeat in Normandy entirely on Allied air superiority and a lack of fuel. They could not allow Hitler or the German public to understand that their entire military philosophy had been thoroughly outclassed by a collection of lost factory workers, farmers, and students who had jumped out of airplanes into the dark. The German officers tried to hide the report because it documented the exact moment their world died. They believed that war was a game of chess, played by masters who controlled every piece with absolute discipline. They failed to realize that the Americans had turned the chessboard into a street fight, and in the dark, bloody hedgerows of Normandy, the masters of the manual were systematically eradicated by the kings of the chaos.